Hello, my friends. The level of propaganda in the West, particularly in the United States, about Russia is staggering. Russia is constantly portrayed as a threat to Western values, to freedom, to democracy, while the basic fact is ignored that for the last 30 years it has been the United States and its allies threatening Russia, not the other way around. If you go back to the collapse of the Soviet Union, you see a repeated pattern. Russia tried again and again to become part of the West, to cooperate, even to explore joining NATO. Those attempts were totally rejected. The door was closed in Moscow's face every time. When I studied NATO's relationship with Ukraine, the picture became even clearer. Ukraine is not officially a member of NATO, yet over the last 30 years it has participated in more NATO military exercises than most actual members. There are now 32 NATO countries. Of those, only 6 have conducted more NATO exercises than Ukraine. That means Ukraine has trained more with NATO than 24 formal member states. Starting in 1995, NATO established a de facto base in Yavoriv in western Ukraine. So throughout this entire period, while Russia was trying to cooperate and find a place within a European security structure, NATO was on the ground in Ukraine, training its military and building it up as a tool. One of the activities at Yavoriv, which used to be listed publicly on official websites before the special military operation, was training Ukrainian forces in cyber warfare, specifically targeting Russia. During the early phase of the current war, Russia struck Yavoriv on 13 March 2022. They hit it with a hypersonic missile, targeting the foreign mercenaries, using that base as a staging ground to enter Ukraine and fight against Russia. That strike sent real shockwaves through the Pentagon and the U.S. military establishment because they did not believe Russia had that kind of precision and capability. It was not the last time the base was struck, but it became a symbol of NATO's forward activity inside Ukraine, and after that, NATO tried to scrub its fingerprints off Yavoriv. The reality, however, is that this war is not simply Russia versus Ukraine. It has been a de facto war between Russia and NATO for years, with Ukraine serving as a proxy. The entire Western effort since the mid-1990s has been to build Ukraine up militarily so it could be used as a wedge and a battering ram against Russia. There were actually people in Washington and Brussels who sincerely believed that if they armed and trained Ukraine enough, they could defeat Russia militarily, break it apart, and force it into subservience to the West. This was not some vague conspiracy theory. It was written down in strategy papers. In 2019, for example, a Rand Corporation study outlined ways to overextend and unbalance Russia. A later paper by Aaron West Mitchell, submitted to the Pentagon around December 2020, made the larger point explicit. The real long-term rival is China. But to deal with China effectively, you first have to separate Russia from China and weaken Russia militarily. The idea was that a weakened, defeated Russia would then become an ally of the West in confronting China. So the long-term Western strategic view was clear. China is the main threat, but Russia has to be dealt with first. Russia was to be used as a stepping stone in a larger confrontation with Beijing. The problem for that plan is simple. Russia has refused to cooperate with that script. On the battlefield, Russia has effectively defeated NATO in the sense that it has exposed NATO as far weaker than its own propaganda claims. Every so-called game-changing Western weapons system introduced into the theater, ATACMS, HIMARS, Patriot air defense, Storm Shadow and Scalp cruise missiles, and so on, has eventually been countered and neutralized by Russian measures. The Taurus missile from Germany is about the only major system that hasn't been deployed, but the pattern is obvious. These systems create a temporary tactical challenge, then Russia adapts, and their overall strategic balance does not change. There was a similar hype around F-16 seconds. They were presented as some decisive turning point. The same with the M777 howitzer and 155mm artillery shells, but the West ran into a hard industrial reality. It simply cannot produce enough ammunition over time to sustain Ukraine's rate of fire. Even Mark Rutte, now head of NATO, admitted that Russia produces more artillery shells in 3 months than all NATO countries, including the United States, can produce in an entire year. This war has revealed NATO's fundamental weaknesses. On paper, it claims immense power, but it lacks the industrial and logistical strategic depth to sustain high-intensity warfare against a peer adversary like Russia. This also shows how badly NATO miscalculated Russia's power. Western generals and pundits, Ben Hodges, David Petraeus, James Stavridis, and others have spent years telling Western audiences that Russia is weak, that its military performance is poor, that it is barely making any progress in Ukraine. They say this while ignoring that the United States and NATO, with all their supposed superiority, spent 20 years in Afghanistan fighting lightly armed fighters in sandals with old rifles, no artillery, no armor, new air force, no satellite intelligence, and still had to withdraw in failure. In contrast, Russia is fighting not just Ukrainian forces, but effectively the combined resources of NATO, and is winning. That reality infuriates leaders in the West because they simply cannot accept that their own narratives about their military and economic superiority are collapsing. A big part of the problem is that Western elites increasingly believe their own propaganda. I used to assume that they knew the truth and were just spinning it for public consumption. But over time, it has become clear that many of them actually live inside their own information bubble. A good friend of mine, Seymour Hersh, whom I've known for more than 4 decades, recently published an article in which a senior intelligence official fed him a completely false picture of Russia's situation. Claims of massive Russian casualties, an economy in collapse, gas lines destroyed, refineries, and so on. Hersh faithfully reported what his source told him, but he failed, in my view, to push back with evidence to the contrary. If you actually look at conditions in Russia, traffic jams from too many cars, no gas lines, functioning refineries, consumer goods available, it's obvious that narrative is wrong. Yet people inside Western institutions repeat this fiction to each other and then act on it. The same kind of ignorance appears in Western talk about attacking Russian energy infrastructure. A senior German politician told me they want to provide Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine to destroy Russian oil and gas facilities and force Putin to negotiate. This shows a profound lack of understanding of both Russia's economy and the physics of modern warfare. Russia uses only about 27% of its refinery capacity to produce gasoline and diesel for domestic consumption. Much of its export volume in oil and gas doesn't even go through refineries. It's exported as crude or gas to India, China, and others. Oil and gas account for perhaps 15% of Russia's GDP. Important, yes, but not so critical that losing part of it would collapse the Russian economy. Even a massive attack on refineries would not achieve what these politicians imagine. Then there's the problem of scale. A Tomahawk missile carries a warhead of roughly 200 and 300 kilograms. It is a precision weapon designed to hit specific targets, not a wide area saturation weapon. My friend and colleague Andrei Martyanov, who grew up in Russia and later immigrated to the U.S., has explained that taking out one large Russian refinery would require roughly 100 Tomahawk missiles, not 1 or 2. The numbers being discussed for Ukraine are in the range of 20 to 50 missiles, insufficient to destroy even half a major refinery. So the idea that a small packet of Tomahawks will cripple Russia's energy infrastructure and bring it to its knees is pure fantasy. It reflects a political class that does not understand modern warfare. Martyanov has written several books: Losing Military Supremacy, The Real Revolution in Military Affairs, Disintegration, and America's Final War, arguing that the United States has already lost its military technical superiority and that the Ukraine war exposes the final decline of the post-World War II Western order. I agree with that assessment. We are watching the end of the system built after 1945. The creation of the United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions, like the IMF and World Bank, and the era in which the United States served as de facto global hegemon. That phase is ending, along with the old colonial empires of Europe. The colonial era that began in the 15th century with European expansion into Latin America, Africa, and Asia, dominated by Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, and later taken over by the United States, has run its course. In parallel, the transformation inside Russia and China since the end of the 20th century has been remarkable. Russia, after the traumatic collapse of the Soviet Union, has rebuilt its economy, its society, and its cultural confidence. China, over the past 30 years, has gone from a country where perhaps half the population was literate to near universal literacy, with some of the largest and most modern cities in the world and the most advanced manufacturing base on the planet. Together, Russia and China are developing an alternative model of international relations that does not rest on outright exploitation of other countries. Look at China's Belt and Road Initiative. When Chinese companies enter a country to build ports, railways, or factories, they don't simply strip resources and leave the population in poverty. China's own experience has been one of lifting hundreds of millions of people into a new middle class. Now, about half the population. 30 years ago, maybe 20% of Chinese citizens could be considered middle class. Today, it is more than 50%. That internal transformation gives them a very different perspective than the old Western colonial mindset. What we are witnessing is the rise of a new global center of gravity in Eurasia and the shift from a US-dominated unipolar system to something more complex. I prefer the term multinodal rather than multipolar because poles still imply a handful of hierarchical centers. What I see in the emerging Russia-China partnership is not a competition to dominate others, but a more collaborative approach built around sovereign nodes, states, or regions that relate to each other as partners rather than masters and subjects. The West struggles to understand that because its entire model for centuries has been based on domination and control. We saw this clearly at the start of the special military operation, when Western leaders boasted that they would make Russia suffer, cut it off from SWIFT, and crush its economy. SWIFT, however, is essentially an email system between banks, an old technology by today's standards. Cutting Russia off from SWIFT spurred Russia and its partners to accelerate work on alternative messaging and payment systems within BRICS and beyond. For the first time this year, the volume of global transactions conducted via SWIFT actually declined. Trade outside Western-controlled channels is rising. China now buys soybeans from Brazil instead of the United States and settles those trades in Chinese and Brazilian currency. India recently purchased Russian oil using Chinese yuan. Step by step, the West is losing its ability to control the world through control of the financial system. At the same time, Western debt levels are unsustainable. The U debt to GDP ratio is around 127%. The United Kingdom is at about 101%. France is around 115%. Even Germany, long considered the responsible one in Europe, has seen its debt explode and reach roughly 80% of GDP, up from around 30% not long ago. Russia, by contrast, has a debt to GDP ratio of about 19%. Western leaders talk about crushing Russia economically, while their own fiscal position is far more precarious. This war is being fought on three interconnected levels. The first is the kinetic military struggle centered in Ukraine. The second is the global economic war waged via sanctions, tariffs, and financial coercion. The third is the information war, propaganda, narrative control, censorship. The West has been winning the propaganda war. Its media system is far more effective at shaping public perception globally than Russia's. Russia is frankly poor at public messaging and struggles to communicate even basic truths about its military strength and strategy. It doesn't have to be propaganda in the classic sense, but it has failed to present its side coherently to world audiences. On the military level, however, Russia has major advantages. Russian manpower currently under arms and ready to deploy is around 5 million. The U.S. Army, by contrast, has roughly 470,000 soldiers. Even if you add Germany, France, and the United Kingdom together, they still do not match the manpower Russia has already assembled. NATO's ground strength is heavily dependent on Turkey, a country European elites do not even want inside the European Union. They want Turkish manpower for NATO, but they don't want Turks as equal economic partners. Internally, NATO unity is fraying. Viktor Orban in Hungary has been one of the most vocal opponents of the current Western line on Ukraine, joined by political forces in Slovakia and the Czech Republic. The supposed unified stance of NATO is more theater than reality. And when Western leaders talk about spending 2% or even 5% of GDP on defense, as Trump once demanded, there is little evidence that their societies or economies can sustain that. Germany, France, and the UK are all teetering on the edge of or already in recession. They do not have spare tens of billions of euros lying around to pour endlessly into Ukraine. On the media side, we've seen a remarkable historical inversion. In Soviet times, the USSR tightly controlled its domestic media and fed its citizens a distorted picture of the outside world. Today, Russia has relatively more open access to information, while the West has constructed increasingly rigid narrative control systems. Western populations are told that Russia is an authoritarian state with no political freedom, that its economy is on the verge of collapse, that its military is incompetent, and so on, while being shielded from evidence to the contrary, such as Russian advances in hypersonic missiles and air defense systems or its industrial resilience. Russia has already deployed 4 different types of hypersonic missile systems that travel at speeds above Mach 6 and can maneuver, making them extremely difficult to intercept. The United States, the UK, France, and Germany do not have a single operational hypersonic missile yet. They talk constantly about prototypes and tests, but nothing is fielded. Russia is at least 10 to 15 years ahead in this particular area, and probably more. I know people working inside the U.S. hypersonic program. 2 years ago, they were promising an operational system by December. 2 Decembers have come and gone, and now they are talking about maybe November of some future year. The gap is widening, not closing. Given all of that, some people ask why Russia does not advance faster on the battlefield. The answer lies in Russia's stated strategic goal and the nature of the war. From day one, the declared objective was to demilitarize Ukraine, not to occupy every square kilometer overnight, but to systematically destroy Ukraine's capacity to wage war. Russia opted for an attritional strategy that relies heavily on artillery, drones, and precision strikes rather than mass infantry assaults. The idea is to force Ukraine to pour more manpower and equipment into defensive positions that can then be destroyed, gradually exhausting Ukraine's ability to resist. In early 2022, Russia's initial moves were based on the assumption that a negotiated settlement might be possible. Talks in Istanbul suggested a framework where Ukraine could retain control of Donetsk and Luhansk regions but provide guarantees for Russian-speaking populations and neutrality. That framework was abandoned by Ukraine under pressure from Boris Johnson and the Biden administration at the end of March 2022. After that betrayal, the Russian General Staff changed course. They began a larger mobilization in autumn 2022 and shifted to a long war strategy, decimating the Ukrainian military and pushing on multiple fronts along the entire line of contact. Today, Russia is advancing from the north near Kharkiv through Donetsk and down to Zaporizhia, even pushing into Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. It is attacking and probing along a broad front. Ukraine's response is to rush units from one threatened axis to another, incurring ever higher casualties without changing the overall trajectory. Western claims of massive Russian losses are not supported by observable evidence. On social media, you can see Ukrainian cemeteries expanding, new graves, and death notices for Ukrainian soldiers. There is nothing comparable on the Russian side at a similar scale. Even anti-Kremlin outlets like Mediazona, which tracks Russian casualties from open sources, estimate around 160,000 Russian fatalities since the start of the war. That is a serious loss of life, but not remotely on the level Western officials claim. In body exchanges, the ratio tells a clear story. Russia returns dozens of Ukrainian bodies for every Russian body it receives back. In some recent exchanges, Russia provided over 1,000 Ukrainian bodies in return for fewer than 20 Russian bodies, ratios approaching 150. That pattern has repeated multiple times in recent months. Ukrainian internal figures leaked from the general staff speak of total losses, killed and irrecoverably wounded, possibly in the range of 1.7 million. Historically, something similar happened in the 19th century War of the Triple Alliance, when Paraguay lost an entire generation of men. Ukraine is facing a demographic catastrophe. Millions have fled, and hundreds of thousands of military-aged men have been killed or maimed. There simply will not be enough young men to sustain the population in the long term if this continues. The West's strategy toward Ukraine, in practice, has been brutally cynical. We deliver the weapons, you deliver the bodies. There is very little regard for Ukrainian humanity. Ukrainians are treated as expendable proxies for larger geopolitical goals. At the same time, Ukrainian leaders bear heavy responsibility. For them, this war has been extremely profitable. Billions of dollars in aid have been siphoned into private accounts through corruption networks. Opposition political parties have been repressed. The Orthodox Church has been attacked, and Western intelligence agencies, CIA, MI6, and others have deeply embedded themselves in Ukrainian institutions. Ordinary Ukrainians have paid the ultimate price for this. Natural resources have also been a major factor. 6 months ago, Donald Trump was fixated on Ukraine's rare earth minerals, insisting that any deal must secure those resources. Yet most of the critical raw materials, heavy industry, and strategic assets are in eastern Ukraine, Donetsk, Luhansk, and other historically Russian-linked regions. In the 1,920 seconds, Soviet propaganda posters described the Donbass as the heart of Russia. That region has always played a central role in Russian industrial and economic life over the last century. Trump likes to claim that he wants to end the war, while European leaders insist on continuing it. In reality, both sides of the Atlantic are two faces of the same coin. Trump is like an overweight man who keeps saying he wants to lose weight, but won't stop eating donuts. If he really wanted to end the war, he could do it quickly. Cut off all intelligence support, withdraw U.S. and NATO personnel from Ukraine, and stop supplying weapons. The war would grind to a halt. Instead, he is shifting the burden onto Europe so that if Ukraine is lost, he can blame European governments for failing to pay and fight enough while claiming he did all he could. Europeanizing the war means forcing European states to come up with the money and materiel to sustain Ukraine. Kyiv has made it clear it needs at least $60 billion a year from the West just to keep its government running, claiming it can raise another $60 billion domestically. But Germany, France, and the UK are all in economic distress. They do not have spare tens of billions to send every year. The EU's decision to remove tariffs and quotas on Ukrainian agricultural imports will devastate farmers in Poland, Germany, and France by undercutting their products. On paper, Europe is supposed to save Ukraine, but it lacks the financial and military depth to do so. The promises are mostly empty. The European Union, as a bureaucracy, is hard to kill and will probably continue to exist in some form, but its effectiveness and internal cohesion are another matter. The real question is whether NATO will survive this war. I do not think it will emerge intact. The alliance has been revealed as a paper tiger. Many of the accusations Western officials made about Russia weak, corrupt, brittle apply more accurately to their own institutions. In the United States, the hegemonic center in Washington is also trying to extract more tribute from its vassals, while its own political system fragments. In Germany, the AfD may be the most popular single party, but has only around 30% support. France faces similar fragmentation. In the US, even though Trump won the last election in this scenario, his support is eroding, and the Democrats are not gaining strength either. There is no longer a broad political consensus